Well, some months ago, when we were sort of planning what Advent was going to look like, this was going to be a children's pageant today. Instead, something even more wonderful is happening. But it's happening off stage, so I've got a sermon. And you can see by the title, The Second Naïveté, Part 3. This is getting ridiculous now. It's kind of like the Star Wars trilogy, sequels and prequels. I was thinking of calling this Skywalker Rises, but that's too pretentious. The other problem with doing a part 3 is that the ideas are rather cumulative. And so at the risk of being redundant, I'd like to review this business of the second naivete ever so briefly, because I think it's important, and we need to know this, as well as we can, whether you use my language or other kind of language. So for a lot of you here, this is the third time you've heard this. But like I say, it's important if we want to understand our spiritual life, which is the main reason we have these churches after all. So, the second naivete, with all of its cool diacritical marks, is, you can pay attention to them because you've heard this before, is an idea conceived by philosopher Paul Ricoeur and popularized by Marcus Borg, who wrote that a person or a culture tends to move over time from a first naivete, a very childish kind of belief system, through a period of critical thought and deconstruction of that first naivete to a second, far more mature naivete. Maturity is happening here, right now, right here. The first naivete is the experience of children hearing myths and legends and Bible stories for the first time. And kids encounter these stories at face value, just like any other story they hear. Santa Claus, Easter Bunny. They don't question whether the stories really happened exactly the way they're told, or if there are any serious inconsistencies in these stories. And the first naivete serves us well for a while. And of course, individuals and churches and cultures can get stuck in that childish stage of development and never grow out of it, never see the inconsistencies. But usually, as we grow older, we become educated, get some experience with the world, and we subject the cultural and religious stories to critical scrutiny and begin to question whether the stories actually happened in real time and space just the way they're told. This is the historical, critical stage of development. Historical critical. And in that stage, it's easy to forget that the stories and myths of culture and history may hold more truth than the simply historical. Many people, academics, writers, comedians, media moguls, get stuck in the critical stage. The popular atheists and even more popular comedians, as we've talked about the last couple of weeks, get stuck in the religious is childish way of thinking. You can talk among yourselves, it's all right. It's really okay. Get stuck in the childish, religion is childish way of thinking. But as I said before, I admire the social criticism that these people offer, helping us through both reason and humor to highlight the inconsistencies in North American society. But they're stuck in the critical phase. The constant sneering at religion reveals a kind of sophomoric state of perpetual adolescence that must have to do with their parental superego. They're still rebelling against dad in some way. And my reaction to reading these critics or watching their comedy routines is usually, okay, you're right. That's funny. But come on, grow up. You're missing out on a whole lot. See, we who have committed ourselves to following Jesus don't have any excuse to hide behind sophomoric dismissal of what's in the Bible. We need to take the Bible seriously, if not literally, and take especially seriously the teachings of Jesus. The message of Jesus Now, these are my words. You have your own, because the mission of the United Church includes intellectual freedom. So you'll have your own way of putting this. But the message of Jesus is that heaven and earth are not really separated, though it may seem that way. There's no great gulf between God and humans, though it may seem that way. Jesus incarnates. That's what Christmas is all about. Jesus incarnates and acts out the presence of the divine in his own backyard. He demonstrates that the Logos, the God utterance that we read about in John chapter 1, has become flesh and pitched a tent among us in the local campground. And Jesus tells us that the presence of God is available at all times and in all places. It always was and ever shall be. We need only to become, what's the word I'm going to use next? We only need to become aware of it. We only need to become aware. As Jesus put it, by having the ears to hear, the eyes to see, and not drifting back to sleep. Now, Jesus lived before the various scientific and medical revolutions, before Copernicus and Galileo explained how the earth goes around the sun, and not the sun around the earth. Jesus lived before the Enlightenment and the age of reason, before René Descartes and Isaac Newton. He lived before the psychological revolution, before Freud, before Jung, who mapped, the inner cosmos, as much as Galileo and Copernicus mapped the outer cosmos. Jesus lived before Paul Ricoeur and Marcus Borg, about 1900 years before. So Jesus doesn't speak in the language of astronomy, or the scientific method, or psychology, or modern interpretation of sacred texts. But that doesn't mean that he's unaware of the whole idea of the second naïveté. Jesus is perfectly aware of this. Listen to this from the Gospel of Matthew. This is a story that's paralleled in Mark and Luke as well, so it's very well attested. And it's from this story that Paul Ricoeur got his idea. Let's hear this.
At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me."
Yeah. That's the second naivete, to become like a child. Well, that's not what we're taught, It's not what we're taught in school. It's not what we're taught in the armed forces. It's not what we're taught on the playing fields, playing football or on the ice rinks. No, we're taught not to be children. Jesus says this. The idea is that a child is unashamed about having feelings and showing emotion or believing that life is good. Children alone are good at living in the present moment. A little kid isn't concerned about the abstract structures and social conventions that we adults have learned to worry about. And he talks about this over and over and over again in the Gospels. Children are extremely trusting. You never have to tell your 6-year-old that food will be in the fridge when she gets home from school. She simply believes in your parental provision. And it's in the same way a little boy so quickly offers to be thrown into the air and caught by his grandfather, right? Which I hope to do very soon. And Bill, you got some practice at this, right? Now, a little kid really wants this to happen because he knows you'll catch him. He knows that we'll keep him safe. So if you grew up in a safe home, and I realize not everybody did, but if you did, you might remember how you were less afraid at night when you knew your parents were at home. Then I could sleep more soundly knowing that they were in the room right next to me, no matter what rumors of wars or riots or assassinations were happening out there in the early 1960s. Jesus is telling us that we can be less afraid and live more abundantly if we listen to his teaching, believe in his promises, and live accordingly. It's not asking for anything else. This is the second naivete that can be reached after going through the desert of criticism, through the desert of doubt, and a certain kind of atheism, which is an appropriate thing to have. They're necessary steps to human development. A lot of churches, as you know, teach that believers should stay in that first childish naivete, where it's supposedly safe and cuddly. But our mission is to move on through the critical stage, through intellectual freedom and fearless spiritual inquiry, because we have no fear of going through the scary stages of criticism, doubt, and atheism. We know that there's something far greater and whole and mature on the other side. The second naivete is what Ricoeur calls mystic faith. The first naivete is religion. The second is mystic faith. And this is a second embracing of the spiritual wisdom in which we take responsibility for our own beliefs, our own actions, and our own spiritual practices, not just what our parents or preachers and Sunday school teachers taught us to believe. So after we've sifted and winnowed all that has passed as religion, this mystic faith, this pearl of great price, this treasure hidden in a field, is what remains. So many of Jesus' parables are exactly about that. Exactly about that. So as the passage from Luke said last week, this mystic faith that Jesus called the kingdom of God is not something you go out and see. It simply is and always has been. And when we become aware of it, like becoming aware that we no longer have a headache sometime after taking a couple of pills. I mean, think about this. When your head is pounding, due to some tension or irritation or anxiety, and you can't put up with it any longer, well, what do? You go to the cabinet and you throw down a couple of aspirin or Advil or some other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory over-the-counter analgesic, and you go back to your task with your head still pounding. Said, I got to get through this. But other than swallowing the pills, you don't do anything in and of yourself to make the pain stop. You don't strive to make the pain stop. That would make your tension worse. But you simply trust that the analgesic drug will block the cyclooxygenase enzymes that make the prostaglandins that produce the inflammation that produces the pain. You may not know the mechanisms. Neither do I. I looked that up on Wikipedia, But you trust that it's going to happen. And it does. It does. Every time. While you're concentrating on your task, you become aware that the pain is gone. You trusted, and it came to pass. Unless you're a pharmacist, you may not have enough knowledge of organic chemistry to know how the pills work. You just became aware that they did. The realm of God, the second naivete, is the very same thing. It's an awareness of what is, always was, and ever shall be. We don't have to strive to bring it in, like so many of those early 20th century hymns tell us to do. Some of those hymns are really tiring. They give you headaches. You know which ones I mean? Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war. We're going to bring in the kingdom with our very biceps. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We'll do all the work because that's what we're trained to do. No striving, no marching, no muscular activity brings in the kingdom. It's an awareness and a conviction that the promises that Jesus makes do, in fact, come to pass. I mean, congregations like ours, full of hard-working, educated people, clever, accomplished people. Well, we need to major in becoming childlike. It's the hardest thing we have to do. Filling out taxes, no problem. Planning for retirement, easy. Becoming childlike, oh boy, that's hard. That's hard. Think of Jesus' 12 disciples, spiritual adolescents as they were at first. Asked Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who gets the highest rank in the realm? And Jesus goes, I'm telling you, once and for all, that unless you become like little children again, you're not even going to get a look at the kingdom. Only those who become simple again, who trust that there's water in the desert, like this child here, well, they were here, will rank high in God's realm. That's a hard saying, and it's the hardest for us to get. Being simple and elemental, trusting in the promises. We have to know what the promises are, of course, before we can trust in them. And we have to know them really, really well. We have to know what the promises of Jesus are, just as well as we know our postal code or our social insurance number. We have to know what the promises of Jesus are, as well as we know the words to Silent Night, in whatever language you know them in. Or something that's kind of unconscious. If you walk into Walmart, Starbucks, Chapters, you're going to hear all sorts of Christmas music that you don't think you know, but you really do. What I want you to do just now, before the kids come in again, is hear in your head the song, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. Not my favorite Christmas song, but you're going to hear it all the time. You got it? Who's singing it? Either Judy Garland or Bing Crosby, right? Sure. Yeah, you can hear the voice of Jesus just as surely as you can hear Judy Garland. And we need to know what Jesus is singing so that we can fall back on those promises when we need them. Anybody find this shocking? Anybody upset by this? You can go ahead and yell right out. So what we're going to do in mid-January, after Christmas and before the annual general meeting, we're going to have a look at the key promises, the major promises that Jesus makes, because they aren't just for Bible scholars or enrobed clergy to know. It's for all of us. Jesus is telling us that the more mature that we become, the more we use our heads, the more we need to use our hearts and become the little children, the little kids, who may know that Santa doesn't come down the chimney, but who knows something far more wonderful than that about Christmas. They know. Of course they know. So the older and more mature we get, the smarter and more sophisticated and well-read we are, the more childlike and simpler we have to become, according to Jesus. So, leave it to Jesus, whose birth we will celebrate in a mere 10 days. Although we're going to celebrate it here in a mere 10 minutes, even more. But leave it to Jesus to turn everything upside down. We think we know what we're doing, and then we read the gospel and go, oh, amen?